None Before Me by Sidney Carrol. John Olney Gresham had time, inclination, and money enough to be a connoisseur. He also had the correct instinct. He was a born miser. What he kept to himself alone. The privacy of property was his first passion and possibly his last. His earliest memories did not include a mother, father, sisters, brothers, nor even relatives of any proximity whatsoever. He had never had a sweetheart. Now, in his last lonely days, he had neither wife nor kin. He had only his collection, his large house, somewhat on the Baroque brownstone side, and servants. These were old and quiet and capable, never offering, never daring to speak one unnecessary word to the master. Gresham timed his movement to the heavy gold watch in his pocket, a time for waking, a time for eating, a time for stepping from the dusty tranquility of his den into the abominable traffic of the world, and thence to the little shops where he did his trading, and a time for spending endless hours with his collection. Gresham was a man who had improved the main strategy of his life, and then stuck ponderously to the stratagem. Connoisseurship had been a whim with him, back in the long ago, and he had devoted his life to it. One nameless day, in his monotone life, he had seen an ivory figurine in a store window. Its simple symmetry had appealed to him. He had haggled over the price, bought the figurine, taken it home to study it, and he had suddenly become a collector of ivory. That had been the first whim. It had taken him, for the first time, out of the aimless rich young man's existence into the shops of the town. But once he invaded the shops, he discovered a world far beyond the one he had bargained for. He discovered that ivory is a world unto itself, that as it gets more and more expensive, it gets better and better. Immediately, therefore, Gresham acquired the most expensive piece of ivory carving in the world. Then he discovered that bagging the fox in the first 5 minutes destroys the very purpose, the thrill of the hunt. So the second whim seized him, in the form of the one inspiration of his life. Why not, if it was such a simple notion after all, why had it never occurred to anybody else? Why not acquire the best single piece of anything in any line? Ivory was simply one kind of hunting. He had conquered it with one bold stroke. There were still diamonds to collect, and coral, and paintings, and tapestries, and there must be many things. So Gresham started to collect the best of anything in any line. His life was consecrated to it. Thus it was that a certain Mr. Peregrine felt safe in his own mind one day when he called Gresham at the one time of the day when the servants were allowed to answer the phone. "I would speak to Mr. Gresham," said Peregrine, who was a master of, among other things, the archaic speech of his calling. "Whom shall I say is on the telephone?" asked the servant. "Mr. Peregrine, dealer in unusual antiquities." Gresham came to the phone. "Yes, what is it?" "Mr. Gresham, I have for you something, the rarest, the most unusual. There is nothing like it in the entire world." "What is it?" "Mr. Gresham, I would really truly prefer not to say. An item like this, it requires an effect of surprise. It must not be described beforehand." "Bring it up tomorrow at 4. "Mr. Gresham, for this one time you must come to my place. It is a large item. It is delicate. It is not possible to transport it indiscriminately. If it were not necessary, I would not—" "Very well. Tomorrow at 4, I'll be at your place." "Thank you, Mr. Gresham." When Gresham got to Peregrine's the next day, promptly, of course, on the stroke of 4, old Peregrine led him into the back room. There it was, on an empire table at which 6 people could eat with comfort. It stood. It was the most magnificent doll's house in the world. It was slightly under 5 feet high. Even to an innocent eye, it was obviously perfect, marvelously perfect in every detail. It was an old European sort of house, almost square, with 4 floors and a gable roof covered with chimneys. A stork in a nest snuggled against one of the chimneys. The entire facade of the house had been swung open on hinges. 18 rooms were thus exposed, and the effect on the closest scrutiny was almost frightening in its perfection of detail. The tiny pictures on the walls, the silver surface in the dining room, the linens in the closet, the rugs, the mullioned windows, the doors and the doorknobs, all these seemed to mock the perfection of the life-sized world. The rugs were made by Abusan, said Peregrine. The little paintings, he pointed at them with a slender gold pencil, are miniatures by Fragonard, Greuze, Watteau, and here, just here, one by Vigée Lebrun, the only miniature she ever painted, worth a fortune in itself. Signed. The scale is actually 1/12 actual size. 1 inch equals 1 foot. The house, in reality, would be approximately 50 feet high, 10 feet to each floor, and another 10 for the roof. Each pane of glass in each window is beveled, every mirror in a solid gold frame. Every gold frame is set with precious stones. Notice, please, where I point the pencil, the detail in the wallpaper. It should be examined with a glass. Now take the glassware. Crystal, every piece of it. The dishes are made originally for the second child. Excuse me. The dishes were made originally for the second child of Marie Antoinette. I have the papers. Now notice the people. And truly, the little people in these little rooms were the most astonishing of all. It is a perverse fact that of all the images man continues to make of man, the one which resembles him the least is the one which is intended to resemble him the most, namely, the doll. Nobody can make a doll that looks as if it breathes, but the artisan who had fashioned the tiny inhabitants of this extraordinary house had come close to the secret. Small as the creatures were, in the living room on the ground floor, an aged grandmother sat in a rocking chair with 4 children seated at her feet. The skin of the grandmother's face was veined at the temples. The wrinkles at her eyes had flickering shadows. She held a piece of knitting. Her hands were brown and waxen and bony, and the flesh and the grace of the old fingers had been so scrupulously copied that they looked remarkably nimble. You would expect to hear, momentarily, the clicking of the knitting needles. The children around the grandmother gazing up at her with loving admiration, were unique personalities, each with a different expression on his half-inch face. In an upstairs room, an infant slept in a cradle shaped like a swan. The child slept, it truly slept. Flights of angels were painted on the walls of the room. Notice the wood paneling, said Peregrine, bending over. But by that time, Peregrine knew there was really no need for him to play the guide on a conducted tour any longer. He had seen the expression on Gresham's face. He knew he had made the sale. "Tell me," said Gresham, trying to stifle his excitement. "This sort of thing, I mean now, doll-houses." "One of the oldest of the arts, Mr. Gresham. One of the most respected. Archaeology shows that in the oldest civilizations the inhabitants of the earth built doll-houses. Toys. This is the ultimate in toy-making. Is there anyone who doubts that toy-making is a minor art, or is a major art?" "I wouldn't know," Gresham snapped. "It is true, sir. One of the oldest of the arts, and here before you the finest specimen ever made. Not the largest, that is obvious, not the most ornate. There are complete models of Fontainebleau in existence, but the finest, beyond any doubt, the finest." "How would I know that?" "I will guarantee it, written down." "All right, I'll buy it." "Very good, Mr. Gresham." "On one condition." "Yes, Mr. Gresham?" "If I ever find a better one, I want my money back." "With pleasure, Mr. Gresham." It was transported with infinite pains to Gresham's house. He had it placed in the den, in the very center of the room. The den was a museum to shame museums. It is unfortunate that after Gresham's death, the room was disassembled piece by piece and raffled off to the bidders. The 200 pieces it once contained now grace some 200s of museums in 200 parts of the world. The monstrous luxuriance of that room is lost forever. In its original entirety, it was fantastic. Gresham had the world's most expensive pieces of ivory, a diamond the peer of the Koh-i-Noor, an emerald statuette 4 inches high, a Da Vinci Madonna, a Shakespeare quarto, and so forth and so forth. The priceless etc. of Gresham's life was arranged in glass cases or leather boxes or under lock and key, and Gresham fondled them one by one every day of his life. He was everything the idea of a connoisseur must be. Rich, miser, haggler, he was also, and this is important, a great lover. He fondled his pieces with his eyes, his hands, even his lips. Every morning he had flowers distributed through the den. The diamond, the emerald, the ivory gave him all the ecstasy of the blood his fat body could stand. Into the very middle of this inanimate harem Gresham placed the wonderful doll's house. It was placed upon a sturdy table, so that anybody sitting in front of it had an excellent eye-level view of most of it. Its position in the center of the den was, in its singular way, symbolic. In very little time the doll's house became the center of Gresham's life. He started by devoting the better part of a whole day to it. He sat in a chair with his hands clasped over his capacious middle, staring at the little objects one by one with placid and puffy eyes. The eyes moved slowly behind the eyeglasses, selecting the single objects to study, then focusing. He sat in the chair until he had memorized the position, the appearance, the personality of every object in every room. He did not touch a thing. On the second day, he began to touch. His short, heavy fingers were not skillful in the ordinary uses of fingers. In a word, he was clumsy. Fortunately, he knew it. He was careful. Delicately as he could, he reached out and felt the texture of the rugs, the surface of the wood paneling on the library walls, the silken edge of a fringe on a beautiful lamp. His pudgy fingers floated through the exquisite rooms like pink balloons. It was enough to frighten the little people. He did not touch them. He did not dare. They were so fragile and so perfect. He shrank from the terrible prospect of harming them in the least degree. On the third day, he began to touch the little people. Now Peregrine counted it the finest day's work of his career when he sold the doll's house. His profit from the deal was enormous. He had wild thoughts that night. Gresham was his client now, his friend. He could sell the absurd old fat man many things now. All a man like Peregrine needs is one such client. Now he could comb the cellars and the collections of the city, the world, and pick the finest and the best, and he could sell it all to Gresham. A man who would spend that kind of money for a doll's house would spend money for anything. Peregrine's dreams ran high that night. He had no inkling of the fact that he had lost for all time the best customer he had ever had. None of the dealers in the city ever knew what happened, least of all Peregrine. Mr. Gresham suddenly stopped buying whenever the dealers called the house at the appointed hour. They were politely informed that Mr. Gresham was not in the market for things. Not any more, thank you. Did that mean forever? Yes, thank you, it meant forever. No, Mr. Gresham was not ill. No, he was not planning a trip. Nobody could understand it, least of all Peregrine. None of them ever had the slightest suspicion of the fact that it was Peregrine who had slain the goose. For the truth of the matter is that when Gresham began to play with his doll's house, he found what he had been looking for all his life. The search of the old orphan was over. Here it was, a real home and family and children to do his bidding. The more he played with the doll's house, the fat, ungenerous, niggardly old man, the more he reverted to childhood. And we will pause there.